our budget for 2026. And we have a new board member joining us, so we need to approve that new board member. So tonight, regarding the budget, which we'll show on the screen here, we are going to present it tonight, and then we'll have a year-end meeting in December, and that will be a virtual meeting on Zoom, and we'll send out all the details for that in the next couple weeks. At that meeting, we will do a recap of everything we've done this year, and we will vote on the budget for next year. And so the good news is that, can we scroll down a little bit, or maybe zoom out so we can see it all on one page? I think that'd be great.
Let's find out.
Good view. There we go. Yeah. Oh, too small.
Yeah. Too small.
Zoom in. All right. So we are. Let's see.
Still tiny
Yeah. Okay. Working on that. What I want to kind of focus on a few things here. I'm not going to go over this in detail because we're going to email it out to everybody so you can look at it closer before we vote on it. But just briefly, like what we're showing here is that we were projecting to be in the red in 2025, which we are. I think a little bit less than what we anticipated. We were able to match our goal on sponsorships. Thanks to companies like Brooklyn Solar, who is here. Thank you, Brooklyn Solar Works. And they're going to have a minute after I'm done here to share some new stuff that they have. And also we've brought on a bunch of new sponsors in the last couple months. So that then translates to what we're projecting for 2026, which is slightly in the red. Before we were like $63,000 in the red. And if you're shocked by that, I'll say that if you haven't been here for the last couple of years, we projected that after we had hired our executive director, that it would take us a few years to get out of the red. And we're proving that it's actually going to be a lot faster than what we had initially anticipated. So next year we're only going to be about $6,700 in the red, it looks like. We may even improve on that, depending on how we do with sponsorships next year. We're still looking to get a home for AAA Brooklyn. That's going to be a priority of mine next year. And so that's it. So we're presenting this tonight. Look for it in your inbox if you are if you read our emails. Hopefully you do. Also, please look at all the companies that are sponsoring us and show them the love that they deserve in terms of when you're thinking about what companies to work with. Think about who sponsors the chapter first, because it's a two-way road here. They're helping us with funds to do all the presentations, all the events that we do, to help fund our committees, and we should return that by appreciating it in terms of giving them work on our projects. So let's look at the next item here.
Julie.
No, sorry.
Alice.
Yeah. So we have one of our board members, Chelsea Davis, who is pregnant and she's leaving the board, and she's been on for 2 years, and so technically we all have a 2-year term here. So we only have one open board member for next year, and we're proposing to fill it with Alice Allen. Do we have anything to say?
We need a vote by the members in attendance.
I think let's just do it this way. Any objections to? Yeah, go ahead.
She's on the committee, right? So she's the co-committee chair right now.
Yeah, that's right.
Women in Architecture.
Yeah, so she's been on the Women in Architecture committee. So she's been involved, and typically we appreciate that involvement to start off before you become a board member. So, any objections to Alice Allen joining the board? All right, great. So these are just sort of things we have to do based on our bylaws. Anything else?
Introduce SolarWorks.
Okay. Going to introduce Brooklyn Solarworks. Thank you for coming here tonight. They're going to do a quick 5-minute presentation, and we'll jump into the program. Thank you, everybody.
I just want to thank you guys for, I just got an email says you're willing to be the gold sponsor for our, the champion sponsor for the Brooklyn Design Award, so I want to thank you for that.
Yes, thank you to Brooklyn Solarworks. They're our #1 sponsor here. Thank you, guys.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having us.
Hey everyone, thank you.
If you don't know us already, we are Brooklyn Solarworks. We are a solar install, design, and permitting firm here in Gowanus. We've been around for about 10 years, and it's very likely we've already talked to a lot of you. So happy to see you again, and if we don't know you, say hi for the first time. I'm Sean, I'm a project developer, and this is Kate.
I'm Kate, I'm a senior PM at Brooklyn Solarworks.
And we'll make this fast and snappy. So yeah, we are Brooklyn Solarworks. We design and build solar specifically for New York City homes. We are 11 years in business with about 3,000 projects done so far that are collecting sunshine and producing electricity. And our mission is to create a more sustainable, greener, cleaner New York City that's more electrified and less reliant on fossil fuels. And we are very excited to keep going. Hopefully this 3,000 becomes a much larger number. And we specifically work on a team that handles projects that are under construction, that involve architects, contractors. So we are specialized in working alongside you all to help build a system that works well with your designs and your aesthetics and fits well within these buildings.
And to add to that, in our specialty projects program, the goal is really to make sure solar is not an afterthought, that you're just checking off your prior design off list, and that we can really work in concert together to design something not only compliant with local laws, but something, you know, aesthetic, cool, works with your building.
Generates power,
Yeah.
reduces the bill, returns on investment, all these awesome things. Want to talk about
Yeah.
how we design?
Sure, so we kind of start all designs with the fire path. The fire code in New York City is pretty restrictive, for good reason. We're all dense, we're all up against each other. Many of you might know this, you need a 6-foot wide, 9-foot tall imaginary clearance that runs across and front to back on most roofs. The larger the roof, the more clearances you need. We won't get into the nitty gritty because we have 5 minutes. But we start with that, and then the leftover vestigial space can go to solar, ideally. That's how the local laws are interpreted. Anything that's not HVAC, events, zoning clearances, things like that. So you'll see here, this is someone's interpretation of the fire path and where they would put solar, and we were able to kind of optimize that. You want to fit as much solar as possible, especially when you're electrifying these days.
Yeah, and the broader story here is that we do all of this for you. We take sort of the heavy lifting of solar out of your hands. We try and make it as easy as possible and as seamless as possible within your designs that you share with us, to build something without extra headaches and to reduce, you know, sort of like hang-ups and DOB restrictions, things like that.
One more thing to add, it's helpful to trade backgrounds so that we're always aligned, like any contractor that you're working with. So we love to just request MEPs, STs, all of the things so that we can make sure our filings match yours.
And the other piece, obviously we need to work within the DOB, roof restrictions, but we know that often you're dealing with local law 92 and 94 on new construction, on new C of O, anything that involves changing the roof. You can often get tagged by the DOB to go back to the design and put solar on the roof. Local law 92, 94 asks for a sustainable roofing zone. We've become very, very good at determining how that works with each building. The goal is to get you through the DOB as fast as possible without headaches.
In addition, our patented canopy is a great way to alleviate the issues and conflicts with the fire path. It's kind of our superstar of products. I'd
Yeah.
say.
And here's a cool case study we did. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, so this is a ground-up multifamily building in Bed-Stuy in partnership with Paul Castrucci Architects. It's a passive house, and Paul kind of had solar in mind the whole time by orienting his top roof due south, aiming to cover it in solar while maintaining that clear path. So you can see his initial sketch was pretty much followed through to the end. Targeting the PLP accounts, the common areas.
Hopefully this fits well within this multifamily theme for today. But yeah, cool example of us working together, creating a system that's not only compliant, but is maximizing the amount of space, maximizing the value for the clients. There's another version of this where solar was an afterthought, and we still put a system in, but didn't save them as much as it could have. That's it. That's it.
And that's that. Thanks for having us, everybody.
Yeah, we are over there. Please, if you want to talk to us about any project, put your name down. I personally will give you a call tomorrow. And yeah, talk to us about any
And
projects.
if you'd like a level or a scale, we have those hands.
Yeah, any goodies. We brought some.
Or a lunch.
Oh yeah, we love lunch and learns. If you want us to come by, please let us know. We'd be happy to buy you lunch and learn.
Thank you.
Where was the cable?
It's right here.
This one. Yes. Okay. It's on that laptop, right? I mean, I don't know. Eugene split, so. Oh, that's a problem. Where's my dude?
I think it was also recorded on
The presentation is on that laptop.
Yeah, it's on this one, yeah.
That's the one. Outstanding. No, they left.
Oh, it was. All right. Well, I'll just.
Should just dive in.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name's Julie Torres Moskovitz. I'm with Brooklyn AIA, as James is. And I'm on the board of directors, but I'm also started up the housing committee this year. So I was here a month ago. How many of you were at the September 17th talk on supportive housing? Anyone? Yeah. Cool. Okay, great. Yeah. So we have continued with this is after that one. So it's really 4 events that we've had this fall. This being the 4th in discussion about affordable housing and social housing. So tonight the topic is rethinking the shape of the city, and I'm going to just introduce the panelists, and then just to give you the kind of run of show here, we thought there's 3 panelists and a moderator, and so I'll introduce them all right now briefly, and then they can talk further when it's their turn. But we're going to start with Michael Eliason, who's the reason that we're doing this event tonight, and 2 in a row, which is kind of hardcore to do 2 architecture events on housing in a row. But he flew here from Seattle, and he's came up with the ideas for the topics with me. And so we're excited to have Michael with us. Large Lab is his firm. He just finished a book called Building for People that he'll speak a little bit about tonight. And he's done a lot of advocacy for zoning code change and work that allows for more affordable housing. So we'll hear from Michael first, and then next there's Stephen Smith. Is he? Oh, there. Okay. He's from New York City. All the way from New York City with the Center for Buildings in North America, which I had not heard of, so I'm very excited for him to be able to talk about his center that he founded and he's the executive director of. And Michael's, you're on the, I think Michael serves on the board of the Center for Buildings. And then the third panelist is Jonathan Molloy, who's from SOIO, and he's senior associate there. He's been working on a lot of different types of projects, and I think you also teach too, right? But more recently, he's been working on projects with Tank House and multifamily housing. I don't know if any of you went to see any of the recent projects I saw. It was at 144 Vanderbilt in Brooklyn with Open House New York. I got to tour, and it's pretty, like, takes your breath away to see what they've done there with housing. So he is going to be the third panelist. And then I wanted to introduce the moderator tonight is Miriam Alexandrov. She's an architect and an urban designer, and she does a lot of research with housing and zoning. I worked with her at WXY, a firm in Manhattan. She went to the GSC for grad school, and excited to have her be the moderator. So after each panelist presents for about 15-20 minutes, then Miriam will moderate discussion and we'll open it up so you can all ask questions as well. So thank you, and I'll hand it off to you. I didn't see the way that you shape it. Do you know if there's a
clicker?
clicker, or is it just sort of someone's?
Might be an arrow.
I think it's
Is there a clicker?
I could sit there and just click.
You want to talk about the learning objectives?
Oh, no. Well, okay. I do want it. I'm sorry. There are learning objectives for 1.5 credits. I don't mean to belittle them, but we will be talking a lot about public safety, welfare, and so I just put these up here, but I'm not going to read them right now. Okay. So we can flip through. This was just that the housing committee is doing a lot of work, so if you're in the Brooklyn AIA or even students at City Tech and you want to partake in housing committee, like, let us know, and we would love to have you. Okay, here we go. Should I help you with?
I think our guy just went to get a clicker, but in the meantime.
All right, I'm gonna be the.
Will it fit here and I could just like hit it, or do we just point it here?
I feel like I need to sit on the floor to like do this right.
I'll just jump down and do it.
No, I will sit on. No, that's not. I'm gonna be rude. Sorry.
Okay, next, we'll get this solved. So thank you for having me, City Tech, area Brooklyn. Julie, thank you for the invite. I'm excited to talk about building better homes and better neighborhoods, because the way we build housing in the US is a complete anomaly. We also have a massive affordable housing issue in this country. This slide is actually a couple of years out of date. It's significantly worse in most of the US. I hear Minneapolis has sort of moderated some of their rents, but it's difficult to afford housing. Of course, New York City has always been difficult to afford housing, but in places that have historically been more affordable, we're struggling as well. I would also pair that we have a loneliness crisis epidemic in the US, and that predates the pandemic itself. A lot of issues associated with the loneliness crisis, social isolation related to heart issues, and just general anxiety. It leads to premature death and all kinds of fun things like that. So I think we need to be thinking about making places where people can interact more with each other. Of course, the climate crisis, right? Climate change is now here in New York City. You guys are pretty front and center on the West Coast. We've had massive heat events. We have seasonal wildfire smoke events now. You guys are even experiencing the wildfire smoke to I think a degree that none of us really expected. And I think that this moment in time where we need to start pivoting to actually climate adaptation. So for me at Large Lab Passive House is a significant approach to this. And this is really important because our buildings are based on climate data that was made in the past, right? Our Earth is warming up, places are becoming more hot, more humid. If we stay on business as usual, this is different from last night. The city of New York will actually be like northern Arkansas, have their climate in about 40, 50 years. So much hotter, much more humid, maybe fun things like corn sweat, all those things that come from living in the Midwest. Not so much an issue here in New York City, maybe a little bit more in Brooklyn. On the West Coast, we focus all of our density on arterials, our highways. I call it truck-oriented density. It's not really transit-oriented density. It's a really horrific way of living. You're focusing all of the multifamily housing, affordable housing, in kind of the most toxic places in the city. And then when we add light rail, again, maybe this is a little bit different for you guys in New York, we're not really cognizant of planning comprehensively. We're not providing abundant affordable housing. We're not providing places for people. This is a new development in Seattle, a new light rail station here, and then all of the buildings around it are somewhere between 2 and 6 stories. It's incredibly low rise. There are no parks. There are no places for kids to play. There are no places for kids to get around the neighborhood without interacting with cars. And so it's like a really horrific way to be thinking about kind of redevelopments over time. And the mode of most development in the US, and I think a good chunk here in New York City as well, is double loading corridor. So this is kind of like living in a hotel, corridor down the middle, units on either side. It's really, really difficult to get the economics of larger units, so 2 and 3 and even 4-bedroom units to pan out. What we see in Seattle is we get these massive, this is almost all new development in an auto row neighborhood. So like here's a little bit like walking around Brooklyn, right? You guys have this really wonderful intensity of shops and retail and small scale buildings. We don't really see that on the West Coast anymore. And so this is like what we see. I think I've seen a couple of these walking around town the last couple of days. This building does not exist outside of the US and Canada. Planners, politicians will play games, will modulate the facade, will mandate different materials so that it doesn't look like one big ugly building, but it is kind of one big building, and we could be thinking about better ways to develop over time. This is in Europe, this is in Germany, Heilbronn. These buildings all look different because they are different. This is a 10-story mass timber student housing, this is workforce housing, this is a cooperative, this is market rate rental, right? So even at the block level, you get this nice kind of economic and social mix of buildings. And these are all single stair buildings. And so I think the single stair is kind of my way of, do we have a, no worries.
Okay, it should be on literally just one button.
Okay. Oh, I'm just
Oh,
gonna
yeah,
do
you
that.
It should work. Let's try it real quick. Let me make sure it does work. Let me try. It worked upstairs now. It doesn't work down here, of course. The battery died. Imagine. I guess not. See something.
Okay, so I've used single stairs like this ability to kind of reshape the way we're designing our buildings, right? A fundamental rethink of housing and design to be more community oriented, more climate adaptive, and hopefully provide a better way of living.
You're gonna have to do it to the room.
Okay, no worries. I got it. It's fine. No, it doesn't work, but it's fine. I'll just go.
Well, that's kind of.
It's okay. For those that don't.
You have a mouse right next to you.
Oh,
Just
it's.
click the mouse.
No.
No?
That's right. So for those who don't know, there are basically 3 means of accessing units in multifamily buildings. Here on the right, the double-loaded corridor. Again, this is kind of the modus operandi of most multifamily housing in the U.S. It's like living in a hotel, right? Corridor down the middle, and then really small units on either side. Single-loaded corridor is a lot less common. It's more common in Switzerland and Europe. I think in the U.S. we associate it with like motels, student housing, so we don't really see it, but I find it a very fascinating typology. On the left is the point access block, single stair building, workforce of urban housing the world over outside of the US. The double loaded corridor, right? So we need 2 stairs, 2 means of egress. We need a corridor connecting all of the units to both of those stairs. It's really difficult to get the economics of larger units to work out. If you're on a busy street, right, you're not getting away from that noise, pollution. If you're facing west or south, especially in places that are hot, you're going to be exposed to a lot more heat. It's going to be difficult to mitigate that. Single loaded corridor, again, you do have opportunities for some cross ventilation. You can have daylight on both sides, but it doesn't get a lot of units in. You can't build a lot, and so I think it leaves a lot of FAR on the table. Cities in the US tend to put way more FAR on a per lot basis than other countries do, and so it doesn't really work out on the economics either. Single stair building, what you generally have is a couple of units oriented around one stair with an elevator core, typically, not always, because of weird building codes. In cities like Seattle, we're allowed 6 stories. We can do 2 conditions of single stair buildings per lot. There's a maximum of 4 units around each stair core. So we can get kind of smaller buildings somewhere between like 10 and 50 units. It's incredibly efficient. You get a broad diversity in unit sizes. It also, in this weird roundabout way, induces larger units. So a big issue we're struggling with in development is like, how do we get multifamily housing? Well, this is how the rest of the world does multifamily or family-sized housing. Kind of the limitations of the International Building Code, I think, are becoming more and more apparent. This is a new development on a block in Seattle, wonderful highway here. You can see these are all micro studios. They have one window that opens. Pollution, noise, you're never opening your window here. If you're on the courtyard, you're in a fishbowl looking at people about 40, 50 feet away. There's no trees, there's no space for a community. It's a very radically different way of developing versus other places. Hasn't always been this way. These massive buildings are really, since the 2008 recession, are kind of when everything flipped. We used to build, the blue line here, smaller and medium-sized buildings, and the green line is greater than 50 units, right? And so now those massive buildings are kind of the overwhelming majority of new construction in the US. Why do I think this is important? Well, our building codes and our zoning codes interact in these really fun ways to influence redevelopment. In cities like New York City, cities like Seattle, where we can do single stair up to 6 stories, you know, we have this existing kind of fine-grained urban street front, right? You go to Brooklyn, you've got 25, 35-foot lot buildings, 8 different things on one lot. So when you go and redevelop something, you can just redevelop that one lot, right? And so maybe it all goes at the same time, but it's like 8 different owners, and they go different ways, and there's like more variation, and you still maintain that fine-grained kind of nature. But on the West Coast and most of the US, all of that is just going to be scraped because of our double-loaded quarter requirements, financing requirements, and we'll just put a big, ugly building with no space for trees or green. But like I said, the rest of the world doesn't really build housing this way when they're doing multifamily housing. They generally do single-stair buildings. It allows for more diversity of units. This is just kind of comparing what a Seattle double-loaded quarter would look like versus point access block, right? So we could get bigger units, larger units. This is for a case study we did for basically doing kind of a co-op for 2 and 3 bedroom units. I've highlighted the stair core here in the middle, right? So daylight in the stairwell, that's pretty rare in a lot of US buildings. It's extremely common in Europe and other countries. Our kitchen, living, dining are oriented parallel to the facade instead of perpendicular to the facade. Our bedrooms, this allows the building to cross-ventilate, right? We've got windows on 3 sides for these units, 2 sides for these units. This is dual aspect, triple aspect, right? And so this is a lot like living in like a detached house in much of the US. This was on a really busy street, so it was really important for them to put the bedrooms on the quiet side of the building. Again, they want to get away from the noise when they're trying to sleep. Usually in Seattle, it's really cool at night. We don't have a lot of humidity in the summer, so everyone sleeps with their windows open, and it's just wonderful. Our double-loaded corridors induce these deeper and deeper units. Again, planning departments, politicians want to ramp up the amount of built area on lots. And so we have these in Seattle 80, 90, 100-foot deep buildings, right? So the unit ends up being somewhere between 35, 45, 50 feet. But you kind of have to fill it up, right? Okay, all of a sudden this 2-bedroom unit has 2 full bathrooms, massive walk-in closets. The kitchen is like 40 feet away from the exterior of the building, so like you don't have any daylight in there. Well, in Europe, again, this is kind of based on the Seattle plan as well, right? Your kitchen is oriented the other way. You've got abundant daylight. You've got cross ventilation. Really, this footprint is kind of the same as the building unit plus about half of the hallway. And so we have these massive units in West Coast housing, 3-bedroom unit, 1,200 square feet, 2 full bathrooms. There's really only daylight on one side of the building, it faces north, so the entire time it's really, really dark. Maybe you're lucky and you can live on a corner. Well, you got 2 bedrooms, and then it's really so expensive it's designed for 2 roommates, so again, 2 full bathrooms. This isn't something you would find in most of the rest of the world. Like I said, this is how the rest of the world builds full family-size housing. This is a single-stair building in Switzerland, 3 units per floor, central stair, again, daylight, really, really important. It has an elevator for a 4-story building. Stephen, I think, might talk a little bit more about this. You've got a 2-bedroom unit down here, you've got a 3-bedroom unit over there, and you've got a 4-bedroom unit over here. There are no windowless bedrooms, and the end units have daylight on 3 sides, right? It's just a very different way of kind of thinking about habitating in the city. I'm super fascinated with Swiss co-ops, Swiss building codes. There is no limitation on the number of single stair conditions in Swiss buildings. So you can do a 9-story co-op like this, 4-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units, right? 2-bedroom units, all of these cross-ventilate. All of these units have daylight on at least 2 sides. And the 1-bedroom over here is a corner aspect, right? I don't know many 1-bedrooms in the US that have daylight on multiple sides. This building is 100% illegal in every part of the US. And it allows, I think, much more diversity in unit types and sizes. Again, if you're a developer, that gives you like more opportunity to kind of tailor your building to different communities or different residents. You're not just doing like everything for students or everything for seniors or everything for tech workers. The floor plate savings, you can get the same number of bedrooms in 4 units in a single stair building versus 6 in the double loaded corridor. We've started looking at some of the carbon impacts of this. Not only are you saving embodied carbon, right? You're getting the same number of bedrooms in 2/3 of the floor area. There are also construction cost savings associated with this. For all of you embodied carbon LCA nerds, again, maybe not so much relevant to New York City where you don't have a lot of mid-rise wood frame construction. Half Studio in Toronto did an LCA looking at the carbon impacts of different building types, all the way up from detached housing to high-rise, and the 6-story wood frame building, kind of pound for pound, was the best from an environmental standpoint. So, does fire burn differently in the US versus Canada? Because our codes are a complete anomaly. Canada's single stair regulations are actually more restrictive than ours, although there is an effort to change that at a much higher level, at the federal level. In 2023, so Seattle has allowed single stair buildings for 50 years. Originally, we didn't have sprinkler requirements. There was no height limit. In the 80s, there was a lot of anti-development insanity around the city. Most of downtown was downzoned. And at that point, the single stair height limit would drop down to 6 stories, and it's pretty much stayed at that point the whole time. In 2023, I worked with the state legislator to basically take Seattle's legislation statewide so that more of the cities who are also having housing crises around us could have more opportunities for really wonderful infill buildings. It passed as a study bill. It's now being reviewed by an advisory committee. I don't know where it sits with that. But related to that, right, I've started having conversations with people in Michigan. Stephen and I know each other from Twitter for like 20 years. And we started talking about single stair a long time ago. And so now there are like, 20 states, I think, that have some form of single stair legislation, either as an advisory bill or a study bill or actual legislation. Right? And this is what multifamily housing looks like on the West Coast. I haven't been in too many apartments in New York City, so I don't know if your apartments look like this as well. But if this was like 2 or 3 bedrooms, right, that's kind of a really, really dark way of living. You know, this would be more common. This is what we lived in. What we lived in Germany was actually similar to this. It's like living in a flat. You've got kitchen, dining space in the back, bedrooms. Your bathrooms aren't opening up into your kitchens or your common areas. Swiss co-ops are kind of like the craziest, the most livable, the highest quality of living I think I've ever seen in multifamily construction. This is a co-op. This isn't market rate housing, right? So there's trees, there's views, there's daylight. Blows my mind. The future of the IBC is a little bit, maybe Stephen can talk a little bit more about this. We have this huge issue now with windowless bedrooms. I don't know how much of an issue it is here. This is a 3-bedroom unit in Seattle. It's under construction. 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, none of them have windows. This is a re-entrant corner of the building. There's a small courtyard here, and so there's only 1 window into this thing, right? This isn't designed for families. This isn't designed for, maybe it's designed for like students or roommates, but like the quality of life in that, right, is really, really, really inferior. And when we start to look at like the neighborhood block scale, right, again, we get that kind of fine-grained urban development, opportunities for different building heights, different types of buildings, different ownership tenures, versus like one big block being massively redeveloped. More opportunities for open space, more opportunities for air to flow through the network. This form of development is really, really common in a lot of European eco-districts. It allows for just a radical diversity at the block level, economically and socially. You could have townhomes, you could have market rate housing, student housing, there's co-op, there's self-built homes, that people come together and build their own housing, right? And you can put it around a courtyard. This is the way people can develop in other places, right? But it's really, really difficult to do that here. And so we don't get that economic and social mix. I also think we need to be taking issues around urban morphology, how we reshape our cities, and climate adaptation, how the heat is going to affect certain areas in the future much more seriously. This is Rieselfeld and Vauban. All of these green areas at night are 35 decibels or quieter, so this is like quieter. These are 4 to 6 story buildings, and it's quieter than the single family neighborhood I live in Seattle, right? So these issues around public health, noise mitigation, quality of life, I think also need to be much more paramount. Can we start to view like redevelopment of eco districts? I was in Hudson Yards today, and it's like the most sterile place I have ever been. There's a park, but it's got cars on 4 sides. There's no places for kids to play. Like I was my mind was blown at how sterile and bad that development was versus something like this. This is Sonnenviertel in Vienna. It's centered around a massive park. There's an educational campus. It's like 60% social housing. There's a pedestrian spine here. And like your kid can go from this corner all the way to school without interacting with a single car. I have 2 kids. It's kind of a big deal for me. Right? I think this is a much nicer environment than living on a highway. You guys are a lot better than this at this than we are. We limit multifamily housing to arterials. I don't understand it. You know, why can't multifamily housing be legal in quieter and nicer places? We need to be thinking about stormwater inundation. You guys do a much better job at this. This is Domek Park in Munich. They turned stormwater retention into a wonderful little play area for the kids. I've never seen it flooded. I really want to. The heat is coming. We do not have a solar protection industry in the US. I think we should. We need one. In Germany, it's very common to add shades. Spain, Italy, same thing. They don't have to be fancy. They could just be little, you know, folding doohickeys or whatever. And so this is one of the reasons why I talk about cross-ventilation apartments is because we need a way to mitigate these heat events, right? And so here in New York City, you're not going to have the most reliable power grid, right? Like you guys are going to lose power in heat events. Well, let's say you live on a south-facing unit, 8th floor in summer, and it's 95 degrees out. Like, how are you cooling off that unit at night? You're not going to be able to. And so fundamentally, not just buildings, but also neighborhoods and designing places for cars, streets without kids. I'm super excited about Mamdani being elected mayor. Having a bike mayor is wonderful, especially in a city like New York. In Seattle, we elected Katie Wilson. She's kind of maybe a mini version of Mamdani. She's a renter. She lives in a 1-bedroom with her kid. She doesn't own a car. So I'm really interested to see how we have these opportunities on the East Coast and the West Coast to really kind of rethink how we live together in society. And I'll just leave you with this. How do our codes affect our quality of life? Well, I think it's pretty dramatic. It doesn't have to be this way. And that's it. Yeah, that was different than the that I said. Sorry about that.
Turn it over to Steven. Let's see if we can get this computer a little closer to you.
I don't have that many slides, so I'm not going to be.
What? Let me just see if
You're
there's
like tempting
any
fate here.
Slack.
No, leave it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
All right. All right.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the executive director of the Center for Building in North America, the nonprofit that I founded a couple of years ago. The goal is to do research and advocacy about building codes. Very exciting, thrilling, relatable topic. So I'm going to tell you all why building codes matter. So the organization is based in the U.S., is based in New York, but sort of national and even some Canadian stuff. The U.S. and Canada have very, very similar building codes, very similar issues. So I'm going to start off this one with a very unprovocative slide. Architects don't design buildings, codes do. So obviously architects do design buildings. A little bit of an exaggeration. But in general, the real estate industry and construction it's a heavily regulated field. And as you become a practicing architect, you find out very quickly that what you can do is actually very circumscribed by the codes, by the zoning codes, by the building codes. So the purpose of our organization is, to do research, advocacy, but on a deeper level, it's to get people more interested in codes and in code development. Ultimately, unless you turn out to be Le Corbusier, you're probably going to make a bigger impact on the world if you become a code official and, legalize a different kind of sprinkler head than if you, design 100 buildings in a city, because cities have so many different buildings that, the code, even small tweaks to the code will probably make a bigger difference on the built environment than sort of any one single building. So, the way, I noticed when Brooklyn Solar Works giving their presentation, what do they start with? FDNY rules. The codes ultimately are where you have to start. You might have these grand designs about something you've seen in Europe. It is not legal in America, I promise you that. So yeah, so I guess, as I go through this, I think the most important thing I want to impart is, if you're a practicing architect, see if you can join, the New York City DOB has code committees. They're going to do a new cycle soon. If you are outside of New York City, there's all sorts of the International Code Council, which writes the building code in the US and not many other countries. Has all these committees. If you are young, starting out, you could work for the DOB and become a code architect or something. And this is probably, unfortunately, maybe, because we'd like to think that the designer has all these options and choices. Unfortunately, this would probably be one of the biggest opportunities for impact. Maybe not unfortunate. I don't know. I find it interesting. Okay, so in construction, there's the YIMBY movement, Yes in My Backyard, to try to zone more land for multifamily buildings. And ultimately, this is playing with the land cost portion of a development project. But in a development project, you've got your land costs, your soft costs, and your hard costs. And so your land cost is obviously the cost of the site that you buy. The soft costs would be the developer's fees, profits, lawyers, architects, engineers, but then the vast majority of the construction is in the hard costs. It's in the vast majority of development is in the construction. So it's in the foundation, the structure, the MEP systems, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, etc. And so if you want to make housing more affordable, the biggest bucket that you have to play in is the hard costs, and one of the easiest policy levers to change this is the building code. So the United States and Canada have a very unique situation whereby as a building gets denser, the per square foot cost of constructing it rises. And this is not a phenomenon you see elsewhere. So for example, in Germany, you go from the blue is single family, the red is low-rise multifamily, let's say a 3-story apartment building, and then yellow is mid-rise multifamily, that's called a 6-story apartment building. Whether it's Germany, Italy, Mexico, obviously Germany's more expensive to build in than Italy, or even more expensive than Mexico. But as you go from, single family house, low-rise multifamily, mid-rise multifamily, the cost basically stays the same. So we have some things that get more expensive. You need an elevator in a mid-rise apartment building. You don't need an elevator in a single family home. You need, more advanced alarm systems, fire alarm systems in a mid-rise that you don't need in a single family home. So those costs rise, but then you have some other costs that fall. So you only need one foundation, you only need one roof, you only need one lobby, whatever. There's sort of fixed costs, and then, so there's some, you have what economists would call economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. They balance each other out. In the US and Canada, this is not the case. In the US and Canada, as you get denser, as the building gets denser, the per square foot cost just rises and rises and rises. And this is a problem because we are, as a society, building more multifamily buildings, realizing the importance of cities. It used to be in the 90s, almost all development was in single family houses, and increasingly it is moving towards cities for environmental reasons, economic reasons, whatever it may be. And with it, we're getting an increased cost of construction that you don't see elsewhere. And I am going to make the assertion that the reason why we have this cost gradient as the buildings get denser is because of our codes. It's not something inherent in the US or Canada that you don't find in Germany, Italy, Mexico. It is fundamentally in the codes. And it is fundamentally a fear of heights in the codes. So as buildings get taller, code requirements will naturally grow. This is the case everywhere in the world. But in the United States and Canada, the growth happens in much larger thresholds and in much more dramatic ways than abroad. So the code requirements come, and they come sort of heavy and fast. So just to give you some examples, at what height is a second stairway required? Typically in the United States, it's around 4 stories. In New York City, it happens to be 7 stories. In Europe, Asia, Latin America, probably something more like 16 stories you can build before you have a second stair. These are approximations, because obviously Europe has a lot of different countries, but you can also think of Europe as a stand-in for Asia and Latin America. Australia, it's pretty similar. Standpipe, this is the pipe for water that essentially an extension of the hose that the fire department uses. Typically in the United States, it'll kick in around 4 stories. I think in New York City, it's actually sometimes 7 stories. In Europe, it'll typically be a high-rise building, so around 8 stories. Stretcher elevator, like the elevator is so large that it can accommodate a fully flat stretcher. Typically in the US, it's 4 stories. In New York City, I think it's 5. Typically in Europe, it'll be around 8 stories. Sprinkler systems, every single new building pretty much in the United States, except for single family houses, will have a sprinkler system. If the code people had their way, they'd even be in single family houses. They are in California and Maryland. In Europe, frankly, you're unlikely to ever see a sprinkler system, but if you do, it'll probably be around 20 stories, something like that. This one's a little too technical to get into, but there's a whole system of vent piping in your building. In the US, it's going to be at any height. In Europe, 10, 20, 30 stories is when you're going to get the separate vent piping. So the point is that, these things are not totally unreasonable for taller buildings, but at what height are they necessary? In the United States, we determine they're necessary at very low heights. Abroad, Europe, Asia, Latin America, typically much taller heights. And, Americans will tell you, well, we hold things to higher standards, but the truth is the vent piping in the building, for example, it's not going to improve your plumbing whatsoever. The second stairway, extremely unlikely in a modern building to ever matter at all. Same with the standpipe. I mean, we have a whole network of sprinklers. So, fundamentally, I think it's driven by, America is a very suburban country. And as a result, the people who write these codes get in this sort of very suburban mindset. It is a fear of heights, a fear of density. You'd like to believe that these code requirements are sort of based in deep technical research and, cost-benefit analyses. The truth is they're not. Everyone sort of gets on a Zoom call, shares their feelings with each other, and you end up with this. So how are codes written? You would think, codes at the end of the day are inscribed into law. The same thing as, heroin is illegal, marijuana is legal, whatever. But, those things are written by politicians. We have debates about it. They become politicized in good ways and in bad ways. Codes are not exactly this way. Unlike the rest of the world, the main building code in the US is written by an organization called, ironically, the International Code Council. The code is not really used outside of the US. That's a bit of a lie that they have in their logo. And it is a nonprofit organization. Technically, it is organized as a 501c6, which is a business league like the NFL or the National Association of Realtors. Makes you wonder, what is the business? And it is a nonprofit run by former building code officials, sort of like a building code deep state, you could call it. And they write this code. It does not have the force of law, but then jurisdictions, especially outside of New York is a little more forceful in writing its own code, but even in New York, a lot of the ideas creep into our code. Especially smaller jurisdictions, they just adopt this code. And so everywhere in the world, codes and standards are sort of this joint effort between government, industry, and labor. In New York City, labor has a very big influence in it. But in the United States, the balance of power is generally tilted towards certain interests. Some major ones are the fire protection industry, these sprinklers that we have in pretty much every building. You don't find that abroad. And then, on the other hand, single-family home builders. So if you look at the way the ICC, the International Code Council, is organized, there's a privileged place for the National Association of Home Builders, which builds, McMansions, essentially. That's the bread and butter. And then on the other hand, the sort of fire protection industry, which includes people in the private sector, but also public sector, the fire departments, fire service. And they have an inordinate amount of influence on this. And what you get is a country full of sort of cheap McMansions on the one hand, and then very expensive multifamily buildings on the other hand. So my organization, we do research about building codes, and if you stacked every building code and standard end to end, you'd probably get a couple 100,000 pages, so I gotta pick your battles. So some of the things that we are working on right now: single stair, which Mike talked a lot about, elevators, vent stacks and plumbing, a very exciting topic, and then waste handling, specific to New York City. So single stair. So for a small apartment building, which is absolutely not what the code writers have in mind at the ICC when they imagine an apartment building, but in New York we have a lot of these. This one happens to be in Jersey City, but it's very similar. 25 feet wide. The lot is 100 feet deep wide. The building, I don't know, let's call it 80 feet deep. If the National Code Writers had their way, it would have these two stairs right here. It's going to take up about 7% of the building. 7% of the building is a lot. Like 7%, can definitely make or break a project financially. So it takes up a lot of the floor plate. It's about 10% of the cost. A stairway, one single stairway for a 4-story building is about $250,000 roughly. So it's a big cost. Next, talk about elevators. So elevators in the United States are about 3 to 4 times as expensive as elevators in Europe. As a result, we tend to have many, Europe, Asia, the whole rest of the world. As a result, we tend to have very few of them. So here's just some examples of quotes for elevators. These are 5 or 6 stop elevators. So in Belgium, Ile-de-France outside of Paris, you'll have an elevator, once you do the sort of conversions of currency and purchasing power, whatever, you'll get $50,000, $60,000 for the elevator. Whereas in the United States, you'll get $170,000, $180,000. So they're far more expensive. As a result, we tend to build a lot more walk-up buildings in the United States than you find abroad. So here's the number of elevators per 1,000 residents in various countries that I could find data for. The US is at the very, very bottom, 3 per every 1,000 people. Surprisingly, the top is Greece with 41 elevators per 1,000 people, and you have a lot of different countries in the middle. So nobody has as few elevators as the United States does. Partly this is because we live in a very suburban country, but still about, 20-30% of Americans live in apartment buildings, and yet we have just a very small number of elevators. We actually have about half the number of elevators as Switzerland, despite the fact that we have the same population. New York City has about half the number of elevators in absolute terms as Switzerland does, despite the fact that we have the same population and obviously a lot more taller buildings than Switzerland. Very low-rise country. Part of the reason for this, so I'm going to talk about elevators not because it's a huge part of the building, it's about 2% of the total construction cost, but you see some of the same issues in lots of other parts of the building. So the one thing that you can see everywhere is over-dimensioning. Everything in America is bigger. So an elevator in the United States is about twice the size of an elevator in Europe for a mid-rise building. So in Europe, a mid-rise building, it will accommodate a wheelchair, a person standing behind it. It will not accommodate a stretcher. The medical responders will take the stairs or will prop you up in some way. In the United States, not only does it have to accommodate a stretcher, but it also has to accommodate what used to be a turning radius for a wheelchair, and now most power chairs can't even turn in these, so it doesn't even effectively function as that. So the elevators are about twice as big, and that drives a lot of cost. But beyond that, we have a different technical standard. So beyond the size of the elevator, the building code is a document. It's not exactly fun to read, but you could probably understand it more or less. But then it references all of these other technical codes. So the building code will say the hallway has to be this wide, the wall must resist fire for 1 hour, but then it'll say the elevator has to be built to some other standard. It'll reference another document. And it's full of this. There's one for sprinkler heads, there's one for, any part of the building you can imagine has a then standard that it references. And there's been a process throughout the rest of the world of harmonizing the standards so that the same gypsum board, the same elevator, the same sprinkler head, the same whatever, any doohickey you can imagine, can be sold all around the world. The United States tends to sit outside of this consensus. So in elevators, there used to be every country in Europe had its own elevator code, its own elevator standard, and then in the 70s, 80s, they harmonized them. They created a European elevator standard. Given that 3 of the 4 major elevator companies are headquartered in Europe, the entire rest of the world, all these blue areas, start to adopt the European elevator standard. At some point in the 2010s, even China adopted it, sort of knockout blow to every other standard in the world, and the European standard took over. So if you make, whether it's a whole elevator or a little part for an elevator, you can sell it all throughout the world, same thing more or less. The exception, the US and Canada, they've stuck to their own standard. What this means is we have a much more restricted market. It costs a lot of money to certify something to a standard, rightly so. Elevators are safety critical devices. It's important that every door, every button, whatever, meet the exacting standards of meet the exacting rules of the standard. But it costs the same amount of money to certify it to the global standard as it does to the North American standard. North America has many fewer elevators. The United States has about as many elevators as Italy or Spain does individually. So naturally, the companies certify to the global standard, and only if they think they can sell tons and tons of them do they certify to the North American standard. So we have a very restricted market in a way that our current president is trying to do for every good in the country by imposing a tariff. So it's sort of similar effect. So as a result, this is a company called Orona. They're a mid-sized European elevator manufacturer. They're directly present in Europe, which has a huge elevator market, the green countries in Brazil, and then they sell through distributors in all of the yellow countries, where they absent, among other places, North America. So you find this in a lot of elevator parts. They'll sell to everyone in the world pretty much, except for North America. So you get left with fewer parts, they're more expensive, the elevator is waiting for repairs, whatever. So that's, so we have the over-dimensioning issue, we have this standards issue, and we have all sorts of oops. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. We have all sorts of other issues in the building code, specifically related to fire. Actually, this one is not as present in New York, but in the rest of the country, you now pretty much need some kind of smoke screen to come over the elevator if there happens to be a fire, because the doors are not considered adequate to stop smoke spread in the building. It's called elevator hoist rate protection opening. It could be a smoke screen, it could be a lobby, it could be slam doors, it could be a pressurization device. The point is, it costs a lot of money. So we require this. You do not find this requirement outside of the United States. Even Canada doesn't require these. The other thing is, elevators cannot share a shaft with the stairway in the United States. It is very common in Europe, Asia, Latin America, for at least a mid-rise building to have the elevator and the stair sort of in this open area. You'll find it on pre-war buildings in New York City as well. This is not allowed in the United States. So we find all of these other code requirements generally for fire protection reasons that make it sort of more expensive to add elevators, and you see it all throughout buildings. All right, plumbing, single stack. So single stack venting. So here's the plumbing codes in the US are very anomalous as well. Just as an example, you have, this is called your drain waste vent stack. So you flush the toilet, water goes down. Here's a toilet, here's a sink, whatever. Water goes down. As a child, maybe you're bored at a restaurant, you're playing with a straw, you stick the straw in your water and you put your finger on top of it and you lift it out and the water comes out. You don't want that to happen in a drainage system. You want everything to flow properly. So as a result, you don't stick your finger at the top, you let water flow down through it. In the United States, we have decided through some sorcery in the 19th century that just having this little thing go to the atmosphere and introduce air into the system is not enough. We need a whole separate system of piping, of vent piping, that connects at every single fixture, doubles the cost of this whole stack. It is necessary at some height, maybe 10 or 20 stories. It's not necessary for a single-story building as we require in the United States. So it's just one example of sort of the over-dimensioning overkill we have in our plumbing systems. And then waste collection. I'm going to breeze through this one quickly. I think I'm over time. So we have a very sort of expensive. So a lot of things I was talking about, elevators, venting. These are mostly, well, not for elevators, but the venting, for example, the plumbing system. This is mostly an initial cost to the building, but our buildings in the United States are also extremely expensive to operate. It's very common in Europe to find a new building where the condo fees are 100, 200 euros a month. In New York, they're maybe they start at 500 and then go up to 1,000, 2,000 bucks a month just to operate the building per unit. One of the major reasons is waste collection. So in New York, we assume that the building has to collect all the waste in the basement, and then someone has to bring it out. And we used to dump our bags bags on the sidewalk 3 times a week. It was very disgusting. There were lots of rats. So now we're putting them in cans. But what this means is you need to pay a super or a porter or whatever to come to your building 3 times a week to bring the trash out, and 3 times a week to bring it back in. And you have for a small building, you're just constantly having people come out to your building to take the trash out. And then when the Department of Sanitation collects it, they have to do it manually. We can't have this mechanical collection that we have in the rest of the world because we have a whole wall of parked cars between the street and the waste container, so they have to drag it. It's one of the most dangerous jobs in New York is working for DSNY. Whereas in Europe, they simply, or in some parts of Europe, in some parts of Asia, not as common, but they do it in many parts, they just put out bins, you take your trash to them directly, they get collected mechanically, very efficient, very safe, a lot fewer injuries, costs nothing to the building. In New York, buildings are paying on average about 75 bucks per month just to handle the waste, to move it from the building to the curb. If you have a sort of common collection system, you pay nothing at all. So that's it. Why building codes matter. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
So now we're gonna have Jonathan Molloy. I'm happy to sit on that.
I can do it.
Sounds like kind of a drag.
I'm gonna sit because I have
You're gonna sit.
I'll
Oh,
just
that's
sit
good.
close.
Each one of us has a different
a different
style.
strategy.
All right.
I think this will work. Hey everybody, Jonathan Molloy. Thank you to Julie and Brooklyn for inviting me, and I think it's a really interesting panel. And so I'll speak about what we've tried to do within these limitations. So this will be a slightly different tack than the two previous talks, which are really showing why it's so difficult to make buildings that have a high quality of life in America. We have started to do that in a collaboration with Tank House here in New York, but there's sort of a lineage of how those projects evolved. So we like to start, and I think this is very related to Stephen and Michael's presentations around some of these drawings in the history of architecture. So many of you architects may remember these drawings by Hugh Ferris of showing what the zoning resolution of 1916 meant for the city. And so this is explicitly, I think, really what Stephen was sharing, is that the codes do define the sort of boundaries or the possibilities, scaffolding you might say, for what buildings can be. Of course, it doesn't determine everything, but it determines a lot. And then the other thing that's informing that is not only building codes, but of course the construction typologies, which are themselves governed by building codes depending on size, type, and otherwise. So those two things are always informing what's possible from the standpoint of any given project. And so from a housing perspective, as we started to think about housing projects, which our office has its roots really in art spaces and institutional spaces surrounding the public. But as we started to think about housing projects, we approached it from a similar perspective. So rather than beginning with the limitations and what's typical here, I'm thinking about it from a perspective both in history and what works in cities and what is valued by communities. So these are two images that I think have informed a lot of the work that we've done going forward. The Ngala in traditional Japanese architecture, and then the New York City stoop, which of course many of us here are familiar with and cherish in Brooklyn. And so these are two things that, as we've seen, are much harder to make these days in contemporary development. We see a whole lot less of, but it was important in our pursuit of these projects to find some of these qualities and bring them to life in new projects. And we also wanted to look a bit at how efforts to design buildings with some of these ethos in mind throughout the recent history of architecture, so not only the sort of histories of traditional architecture, but what has happened in the past, say, 50 to 75 years. And there was this interesting ambition in the modern movement of the 20th century to bring some of these ideas of urbanity and collectivity to a previous housing crisis, so to figure out how to solve a mass production of housing, but to maintain a level of humanity through them. And so there are some very interesting projects that were made that also suffered from another problem that we might say, not only building codes, but of course the sort of economic realities that related to them. So there were some very interesting architectural projects that had aspiration, but perhaps didn't find their ultimate goal. This is a really interesting one in the Netherlands. Similarly, Park Hill Estate in England, and then probably the most familiar to many, the sort of Pruitt-Igoe of England, of the Robin Hood Gardens by Robert Alison Smithson, which again pursued these ideas of shared communal spaces living together in a high density context, but suffered a difficult fate based on the way that those projects existed in a political and economic landscape that perhaps didn't set them up for success. But then there was an interesting moment, and this aligned a bit with when our housing projects kicked off, was our relationship to housing in the context of the COVID pandemic, when our relationship to space, to air, to our neighbors shifted out of necessity. And there were interesting examples, and in these two cases, two different experiences of the COVID-19 lockdown, and the importance of outdoor space and the possibility of relating to people and living in a way that was both safe and comfortable and allowed connection despite the limitations of the pandemic. And while those opportunities do exist, many of us experienced this, and we see a lot of development in America. I think Michael and Stephen showed this around a double-loaded corridor, where the corridor actually has never really been a source of community, and additionally became problematic in the experience of health and safety in that context. So all of that informed the way that we were thinking about housing. And the first project that we did actually, and I think in large part this made it possible for us to realize projects that were different than what's typical by beginning outside of the American context. So our first housing project was in Leon in Mexico, in a rapidly urbanizing environment. Leon is one of the major centers of automotive construction, so a lot of cars that became, particularly Mexican production of cars became, I feel like, known to many people through all of the tariff battles, but Leon is one of the places where this is all happening, and with that came a lot of urban expansion and need for housing. As we're familiar, this is the housing problem in many parts of the world is not limited access, but it's expansive production of low quality housing. And so they were very interested in creating high density housing, but that actually had a high quality of life. So you can see here a bit of what the context was that we were entering. And so early on in this project, we were thinking about how to expand not only from the double-loaded corridor, which I think has been expounded upon significantly, and all of us know quite personally probably. And so a courtyard being a secondary typology, one that introduces a sense of communal space. It also allows for the possibility of a single-loaded corridor rather than a double. But we took that a step further, and this is perhaps where the building can have a relation to the city, not only to itself. So by allowing the corridor of the building not only to be an exterior corridor, but one that sort of dances between the interior courtyard of the space and the city, which creates a level of openness from building to city, so not creating necessarily an enclave, but something that has a relationship and a porosity to the context around it. So you can see here some early studies of what that meant from a massing and architectural standpoint. And form finding and ultimately looking for the possibilities that are generated by that type of organization that not only create a sort of circulation path, but also finding spaces like those projects, like the Robin Hood Gardens or early modernist aspirations, but also community spaces that are sort of between one's home and the city. So third spaces or outdoor gathering spaces. This eventually took shape in a building that surrounds two courtyards. It also steps in a few different levels, which creates different roof gardens, and also allows for basically pockets where units are omitted, which allows sort of gathering spaces, but also an openness between the city and the center of the building. And so here you can see what that means in a floor plan. This is also a mixture of unit types. All of these are both, by having a single loaded corridor, have exposures on two sides, right? So they're allowing for cross ventilation through it. And then, of course, for the context of the conversation today, stairs and vertical circulation was also a very important consideration in thinking about the movement of people through spaces. And so this is where we found, in this case, this is a two-stair building, but one of them is tied to the elevator core, is open to the elevator the way that Stephen was sharing, that is not legal in America. The other, which we found is legal in America, is having an egress stair that is also an exciting stair, one that is part of the experience of the building and not something that is inside of a concrete shaft. And you can also see here how the corridor sort of moves between the inside and outside of the building, defining a slightly different variation between units and buildings. And then here are the spaces of gathering and communality throughout. And here you can see a version of a single unit. So I think through this project we were also confirming the importance of multiple exposures and having a dynamic relationship to the atmosphere and to the outside. So pushing back against the single exposure of a double loaded corridor, and I'm inviting the dynamism that comes with having openness on both sides, and also the opportunities that affords for cross ventilation as well. The other thing that we looked at here, which I think is not as relevant to the topic today, but was the manner of construction. Of course, Mexico is a different climate than New York, so there's a little bit less pressure on the performance of the envelope. We're also thinking about how, in this context where it's labor of people is less expensive than material. So, in New York, a lot of times we look for ways to reduce manual labor because that's one of the more expensive things. So we look to prefabricate things, panelize things. In Mexico is the reverse. Labor was actually much more affordable than mechanical means. So we looked at a few different methods of constructing components and ultimately landed on prefabricated concrete units that are the heaviest that a single person can lift and install by themselves. So that was sort of the perimeter around the geometry that came to inform the way that this construct realized the original sort of architectural goals of the envelope. So you can see here how it was being mocked up, and then ultimately as it started to be put in place. Of course, you also see here no thermal breaks. Thermal bridging is not a concern there. So there were certain simplicities that were offered by the Mexican climate, but ultimately that manifested itself in sort of a unity between the construction method and the architectural expression, and manifested into a really interesting, beautiful building that has an animation of outside, of landscape, of people being together. And this is a recent photo series that Yuan Bond did to go back and visit the building 4 years after construction to see how it has been animated, and it's been, I think, a success in the ways that we hoped it would. So that was really a pilot project for us that I think made our New York projects possible, and they inspired the collaboration that we have with Tank House, which is a really amazing development group based here in Brooklyn, the son of an architect and a former architect, who I think believed in the possibility of making things that are different than what's typical. And so 450 Warren is a project, our first project with them, which is located in Gowanus, right at the corner of Bond and Warren. It's a corner site, and this sort of started a thesis that we've carried through with them. We're on our fourth project, I'll show two. And one of the main philosophies of these projects is to try to break down and push against a lot of the things that Michael and Stephen shared, or towards some of the things that Michael shared, is to have access to outdoor space, to have always multiple orientations, to create opportunities for collective life and relationship to the people you live with, and to have a sort of sense of porosity and relationship to the city, so not only the building itself, but also to the space around it. And so we've sought to do that, and I think this really evolved in these projects by pushing what a corridor can be, and particularly once we've broken the threshold of making an exterior corridor, opportunities expand. The other thing that we're always doing, and looking back to that Hugh Ferris diagram, or drawing, here a diagram, is what the relationship is of a building's volume and the space that it occupies versus the FAR, the floor area ratio, so how much you're allowed to build by code. And so one of the things that these projects are always doing is to make the biggest building possible. So oftentimes FAR and zoning envelope don't match up with each other. You can take up much more space than you're allowed to build from a zoning standpoint. So these projects all push to the outer bounds of the zoning envelope, a lot like that Hugh Ferris drawing. And then the space that is found in between is connected by exterior corridors, which become an animated form of collective space. And so we've had to do a lot of choreography to understand how to best manifest those in the zoning code and otherwise. And then you can see here what that resulted in at 450 Warren is effectively 3 independent buildings, not one big building. And those 3 buildings are connected by exterior corridors. And within those buildings, every unit has dedicated outdoor space, and they also have multiple exposures. So the stepping of the facade is also creating corners that allow windows on multiple orientations. And in many cases, we get units that have actually 4 orientations. So they are effectively like a single family house as a part of a collective 4 stories in the air. So here's an early model of the building where you can start to see how it takes shape. And part of this was also pushing back against the typical, I actually just heard a new term for this, of the traditional development balcony. I just heard it referred to as a diving board balcony, which I think is an appropriate name, which you see very few people sitting on in New York as you drive down FDR West Side Highway. Here we thought about balconies as outdoor rooms, so they're actually part of the facade. One of the things about that is that it counts as FAR, and once you enclose it more than 60%, which again, that's a question why we treat it that way. We disincentivize making beautiful outdoor spaces. It's unclear why. And then one other interesting, funny code item here is this wall, which comes from an expectation of the zoning code for the continuity of a street wall. So here, this is actually a large outdoor terrace elevated 1 story above the mixed use part of the building. And so we were able to achieve a continuity of street wall by making a large planted growing surface. So it became kind of actually a beautiful, sometimes the weird codes lead to interesting solutions. So here's some photos of the building built. You can see here the organization of those 3 volumes connected by these exterior corridors. And one of the things that the corridors also did is to create real porches for buildings in a multi-family context, so that each unit actually has a small entry porch where shoes, bikes, strollers live, the way that I think many of us may be familiar with in a different context. And many of these are opening onto shared outdoor spaces and planted zones. So you can see here the entry is into a central courtyard, and then the egress stair, one of the 2 egress stairs, is different at every level. So it sort of dances up its way through the outdoor corridor, and then instead of using a traditional guardrail, we use a stainless steel mesh that takes on the sort of complex shape of those different corridors relating to one another. So you can see here the stair going up through them. Each of those units having exposure both to the outside world and to the interior courtyard, where you have an opportunity to relate to your neighbors. And so you can see here some of the different characters of spaces that are made possible through it. This is that court that I was saying is behind that street wall we mentioned. And then how some of the life of these units has started to become animated. This is one of those outdoor living rooms of a balcony. This is a window onto that courtyard. So there's many different types of relationships. Some offer you an opportunity to create more of an openness to your neighbors, not unlike if anyone's ever been in the Jordaan in Amsterdam, the historic neighborhood. The relationship between one's interior space and the community is very different. There are no curtains, there's no stoops, there's much more openness. So I think this offers also a variety of opportunities to relate to those around you. And this is what I was saying about how these spaces have started to be animated by the life in them. And then this is recently how the stainless steel mesh has succeeded in what we were hoping it would become, as this growing wall, to actually bring the sort of ecology not only in the sort of base of the courtyard, but up through the spaces inside of it. And then most recently, we're currently working on a project on the Gowanus Canal, which is experimenting with pushing these ideas to a much larger scale. So 450 Union is a 20-story building. It's part of the upzoned Gowanus Canal, which, if you have not been biking through there like I do every day, it's maybe not the most spectacular collection of buildings that New York has ever put together, and I think a lot of that is based on some of the limitations that we've talked about today. So we took on what was ultimately a pretty difficult challenge, is like how can we translate these ideas, which are really around a smaller scale of 3 projects we did before this were 18 unit, 21 unit, and 26 units. So 4 stories, one is 8 stories, one is 6. So this was a new scale for us collectively. And we were trying to translate those ideas that we had worked on previous projects to a larger scale, a higher density. This also includes an MIH, so this has a mixture of affordable units built into it. So the first 3 I just showed were market rate. And so what does that mean in terms of matching up against a pro forma, a development plan? And so we really wanted to focus on what are some of the essential things that we couldn't lose. One of those is multiple exposures, always maintaining multiple exposures. Another is outdoor spaces, and then as much as possible to create out front doors that are into the world rather than into a double-loaded corridor. Of course, it's a much bulkier building. There's 156 units rather than 18. It's also a very big lot, which is something that we're trying to talk to the city about in terms of the way that they're managing the zoning. But you can start to see some of the ideas of collective spaces that are dancing through the building, creating porosity, creating as much outdoor space as possible throughout. And so you can see here the floor plan. One of the main moves you'll notice is the sort of sawtooth stagger of the plan, which affords every room, and so that's sort of the module of a room, always having windows on 2 corners, which seems not so significant necessarily when you see it in a plan, but it does actually allow sun to move through the unit for much longer throughout the day and land in spaces in a much more dynamic sense. And you can see here it's sort of a mixture of the double-loaded corridor, which is really the result of pressures of the economy like we've been talking about, but as well as many single-loaded corridors and sort of gaps between those. And then that leads to a series of, let's say, more variety than on the earlier projects, and also a combination of balconies. And in this project, we have Juliet balconies, which are very common in Europe, which is essentially a 0-foot balcony, but it allows you to open windows. And so this is one of those here. So where you can have a truly sort of fully open window with a small balcony in front of it. So it breaks the difficult building code requirement that you can only open a window 4 inches for safety reasons. But that's not super satisfying from a life experience standpoint. So a Juliet balcony is actually one way that we found to create a more robust opportunity to open windows in a city where there are beautiful moments to do that. And this is that relationship on Union Street, some of the courtyards that are at different heights and different levels, and how those are porous through to the city below. And we are currently, I think, at the 10th floor of construction right now. So these were taken maybe 2 weeks ago. And we'll see how this one turns out, but I think we're hopeful that some of the successes of the earlier projects will be able to manifest at this scale, and we're hopeful with Tank House that these will also be proof of concept of these things, not only at a higher density, but also within the context of affordability. That's it.
Get the grip on it. You have another slide?
Yeah, so that I don't have to.
Otherwise, I'm very happy to keep the thank you.
We could go back to the AIA one and just put.
Great.
Do you have a mic that works?
We have 2 mics.
Perfect. We're doing well on time. I just want to start by thanking you all for your really fascinating lectures. I certainly appreciated how tonight we got perspectives both from design, policy, certainly code perspective was very much present in all of the discussions. I know as a young architect, I starting out in design sort of very quickly realized how much zoning and code affected what I was doing, and I became interested in those issues of code and zoning because I realized that if I was passive to them, then that would really not allow me the agency to design in the way that I wanted to and to have the impact that I wanted to have. So I'm really glad that we're having these discussions through AIA Brooklyn and really thinking about, as designers, how we're forceful in shaping the code and really being responsive to how it affects the work that we do. And also, as you all spoke about, how it affects the quality of spaces that we live in, the environmental impact of those spaces, and affordability also was spoken about, which is obviously in New York City a huge issue as we have an affordable housing crisis. So I think really, pressing issues that are affecting quality of life and quality of design. So I really want to thank you all for your very interesting presentations here today. We have a couple questions that we've prepared, but I also want to make sure we leave a lot of time for the audience to get involved and ask your questions. So certainly we'll start off with a couple questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. First thing I wanted to ask all of you about, I think in having a discussion about buildings focused on stairs, we often looked at, middle height buildings, or as they're often referred to as missing middle, type buildings. And so thinking about typologies, are there typologies in changing both either the egress or systems, for instance, that Stephen talked about, that are opened up when we make those changes from a code perspective? This could be formal typological changes, or Michael, I know you have some examples of ownership models, for instance, that are opened up through some of these changes. So be really interested in your thoughts on typology and form.
How about now? Okay. On the typology, we're in New York, right? All your buildings are a lot bigger than the rest of the US. You guys are an anomaly. But there is this interesting thing going on in China where they allow single stair to like 20, 18 stories. South Korea is very similar. Japan as well. I think about 10. Then you start to get these really, really tall buildings which have a much thinner floor plate. And instead of having very deep buildings, they're very wide but very narrow. And so you have the opportunities for taking like the diagram of the low-rise. Sorry, my brain isn't working. The low-rise single-stair building and taking it up to like 10, 15, 16 stories. And so you have 3-bedroom units that have daylight on multiple sides, but you're at floor 16, floor 17, floor 18. And this is actually like the typical form of new development in China. I think Singapore is very much in this grain as well. So there are interesting opportunities for high-rises to do something like this, to start kind of rethinking around these issues around dual aspect and ventilation and other things. But like, it's really, really difficult in the U.S. context with our double loading corridor. I think actually the work that you guys, Jonathan, are doing, and Florian and I were on a panel like 5 years ago, I think it's really groundbreaking, right? Like you are really pushing beyond the kind of typical typologies that we see. And so I'm hopeful that we start to see more. I think with more people understanding the limitations of double loading corridors and that there are different ways to build, that we'll start to see more.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S. context, given how conservative we are, if you have any new idea, like for single stair, for example, at the national level, like fighting tooth and nail for 4, 5, 6 stories. But abroad, that's still very conservative. In China, yeah, I mean, you look at those like seas of high-rise buildings, and they're not double-loaded corridors. It's like 1 stair. If it's above 18 stories, it'll be 2 stairs with scissor stairs, and then there's 2 or 3 units off of the core. And in Europe, you can go even taller. In Switzerland, I've seen 30-plus story buildings with a single stair. So they built, the same way that in New York we would build a little 4-story building. So, yeah, I mean, I like in the U.S. context, like really fighting to get mid-rise buildings that are sort of urban and small. But the truth is, if you go abroad, if we treated the code officials in the U.S. like adults and not just, like, come on, 4 stories, 5 stories, you could really justify going much, much taller.
I think something else that I really appreciated Stephen also suggesting, I don't know how many students are still in the audience, but of suggesting that young people get into these spaces that really do end up defining what is possible. And I would say that code was one that we, I would say, certainly had to take as a given when we were designing these buildings, but the sort of typological shifts that we were pushing for and ultimately succeeded in took a lot of other people to take a lot of risks, because conservatism is not only in the code, it's also in financing and sales, I would say, are the two most important ones. So on 450 Warren, and there is a nice article about this in the Guardian that Ollie Wainwright wrote not too long ago, that I think the title of it was that the banks thought we were mad, and that ultimately it was a very difficult project to finance because no banks were interested in offering loans for it because they didn't know it and they didn't have familiarity with that typology. And similarly, the original brokerage company that was on board in the design phase that would be responsible for selling the building said it would never be able to sell. And so we worked, fortunately, with a partner in Tank House who was much more willing to accommodate the risks associated with pushing against things that are normative and expected. And so they found other sources of money to finance the projects, and they fired that brokerage company and hired a new one and said, you have to, this is a given, you have to be able to sell it, so you join if you want. And so I would say that this is also something that in Room of Architects we're also trying to figure out if there are other developers who are willing to take these risks. And so we're finding that most of the opportunities in the housing space are coming from next generation developers, so younger developers. A lot of times the children of old real estate and development families who have ideas about architecture and aspirations to do things beyond just satisfy the bottom line and build the most profitable projects possible. But I would say that while the design community is really inspired and excited by these projects, it's not something that has yet broken through the more conservative and let's call it the real estate deep state. I like that. So I think that's a real thing. I think these projects are not yet being replicated, and we're doing them with Tank House, but I think finding more people who are interested in taking on all of the complexities and difficulties of developing projects and having hopefully those people have aspirations and values that are beyond some of the most conservative, be they health and safety or finance, I think is going to be really important for actually changing the fabric of the city.
Can I ask a question? The brokers and the banks, what did they object to? Was it the exterior egress?
Yeah, so exterior corridors was a big one. There was a belief that is not something that was desirable to the New York market. The other one is from a financial standpoint. Obviously, these projects have a lot of envelope, so they are not the most efficient from a sort of hard cost standpoint. Right, the cheapest building is typically going to be the one with the least number of corners, the least amount of envelope. Envelope, in the spreadsheet that Stephen was sharing before, envelope carries a lot of cost, particularly in a climate like New York's. So just from like a basic, and the third is efficiency, right? They have super low efficiency. So a lot of developers, sometimes they'll even write into your contracts, you have to meet like a 93% efficiency. They'll actually dictate what efficiency is expected of you contractually. Sometimes, so we'll show these projects to big developers and they'll find out what the efficiency is, and then you'll see their eyes glaze over, and then they never call you again. So that's the other thing, is that the relationship to standard metrics of a successful development project do not apply here, right? So the ways of evaluating success have to be different, and so that's what I mean about people having the ability to see value in unconventional ways, right? And of course, single-loaded corridors, like we see in Robin Hood Gardens and other projects, have this bad association in America of sort of social housing experiments that failed. So I think there's also, we're carrying with us some legacies that didn't get a fair shot to succeed, that may have been really fantastic architecturally and spatially, but were sort of cursed by the political environment that surrounded them.
Okay, I'm gonna, one more question, then I'd love to open it up, because I think there's so much to talk about here. Stephen, in particular, you talked about, and you sort of had a call to action for us to change certain codes. I had a question. You spoke about the consensus making model of changing codes, which is fairly typical. However, my understanding is there's sort of been a push to move towards more of a legislative process. So for instance, mass timber, Michael's making a face, mass timber out on the West Coast really was pushed through more of a legislative means and that sort of process of advocating for change. So I'm interested if you could speak a bit about the different ways of changing code. What are your thoughts on them, and where can we as architects kind of have influence?
Yeah, in the among the building and fire people, the most controversial thing that I've ever done was like talk to legislators. So codes are ultimately adopted into legislation, but maybe a little less so in New York, but nationally there's this sense among the professionals who write and enforce them that politicians should have no involvement whatsoever in writing the codes. It should be the building officials, the fire officials, whoever they are willing to invite in, and that's that. And the argument is that they're the professionals, they understand the technical details, the politicians are easily swayed by this or that lobby. And I think there's some merit to that for sure. Like it can be a little frustrating to have to explain to somebody, I don't know, various technical details. But on the other hand, the building officials and the fire officials who write these have their own myopic, very narrow view on things. I mean, even on safety, like they don't consider the safety of, driving 50 miles to get to the single family house and all the, car crash risk there is on the way. They're very narrowly focused on fire. They don't even really consider, what is the safety risk of living in a walk-up building. They're only concerned about, what if there's a fire? Is the elevator gonna perform as I want? So I would say, I think that building officials should aspire to be trusted more by the politicians. And the politicians, at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, and I don't know, like Churchill or whatever said, it's the worst system except for all others. And so, to have this, just dictated by these building officials, I mean, that's just not how any part of our society works. So I think that, I found that politicians are often, well, they might not understand the technical details, they do sometimes see the bigger picture better. A lot of the building officials believe that any requirement they can impose is a de minimis cost. And so we can just assume if I write something, that's how the building's gonna be built. But in reality, buildings won't be built if the cost gets that high. And so you need to balance, what is the safety of the existing housing stock? What is the safety that we're gonna impose? What are all the other societal, affordability, even other safety risks like, road accidents, whatever. So I think ideally the process would be a little more involving of other parties. And yeah, that's my opinion. I think politicians actually have more of a role than have historically played.
That was well said.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna bring out the mic to the audience so we can hear your questions. Is that good?
Oh,
You want me
Here,
to- Julie's gonna be our runner.
Yeah, I can take questions here. Okay. Here and then I'll go. Yeah.
I have a question about when the transition happened to the dual egress code that we currently have, because there are examples in New York City of single egress buildings. For instance, one that I know of that's actually a series of really great buildings are the Queensbridge projects, which at one point were the second largest public housing development in the US. I think it might now be the largest, because Peridigo is gone. But that basically consists of a pinwheel building with single stair and single elevator at the center of it. And each of those obviously, like Corbusian kind of, towers in the park kind of concepts that was typical for these kinds of buildings in that time period. And so I'm wondering when, based on that divide, like of where we are now and when that was built, when exactly did this transition happen towards the dual egress as the main driver?
It's been there pretty much. I mean, there was a tenement fire in 1860 on Elm Street, which is now, I don't know, something on Lower Manhattan, and then you get the exterior, what are they called, fire escapes, and that was historically. So I'm looking at Queensbridge houses on my phone. Are you sure it's single stair? Is it not a scissor stair in the inside of it?
I'm pretty sure it's single. I can't remember if it's scissor though, but
It's, I mean,
actually walked it.
my understanding is they had to have scissor stairs, so you know,
Okay.
scissor stair. It's possible that it is single stair. There was, in the beginning of the century, there were very confusing rules, it was actually kind of vague, about whether you needed a second stair. The vast majority of buildings certainly have second stair. Usually it's a fire escape. There was some exemption. It may apply, actually now that you mention it, 10 Ike houses, Williamsburg houses, I'm pretty sure has a true single stair. The NYCHA projects might have played around a little. They were very obviously concerned with affordability, but it's kind of been with us since the start with small exceptions. Maybe Queensbridge is one of them. I've actually looked for plans of NYCHA projects and you can't find them,
No.
which maybe explains why it costs so much money to renovate them. I don't even know what they look like inside. So it's been with us for so long, although for a time it was, the fire escape kind of gives you a lot of the benefits, although good luck getting out of one of those in a fire. That's my understanding of the history.
Just to add one thing, which was about your point of the corner. Oh, to your point about corner windows, that project also had those buildings also have corner windows, resident rooms at the corners. And what's neat is, you know, like having lived in one for a period of time, you can actually watch the sun migrate across the sky and watch the color of your walls change just based on that. And it's such a beautiful experience that you don't really see too much of in the U.S. And they're kind of also rotated 45 degrees on the access, north-south access, so you do get that corner kind of vibe. It's really cool, but really neat precedent for the aspirations that you mentioned.
Yeah, and maybe something to add to that, because I think we were seeking to do that for every room, and I think there's something special about that, but I think to speak to maybe how bad things have gotten in development is that, let's say in other projects, even if on a given room you can't do it, like the apartment that I live in, you know, top floor of a brownstone in Gowanus, I can at least get it across the apartment, right? So like, you can see the sun on one side, and then on the end of the day, it switches to the other side. But I think so much of what we develop now, and I think Michael showed a lot of these, is you get one, right? And you have your living room, then you have your 2 bedrooms, you have a bathroom, probably it's not going to have a window. So if you're north facing, you never get it. If you're south facing, you're always getting it. So I think there's something about a lack of variety and the depth that it's creating. So I think we were trying to do it. I think in particular it had its value in the Union project, which is high density, where there are less opportunities, where we were forced into a double loaded situation, that at least we were able to get it on a per room basis. But yeah, I think that experience of relating to the sun through the day is part of like being alive. So it's bizarre that that's not a priority anymore.
You're right, they are single stair. It's actually really cool. And it's like a closed stair too, I think. It's not even open.
It wraps around the elevator.
I have no idea how they got away with that.
Yeah,
It's really
well.
You got to get Steven some
Yeah,
plans.
new research
Yeah,
project.
I think I
yeah.
found the plan. Yeah, wow.
He's off.
So, first of all, thank you for those 3 fantastic presentations. I was just wondering, we live in a very litigious society full of insurance requirements. I'm wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Stephen. Is it Stefan or?
Whatever, Steven.
Okay, Stephen. Have you done any research on insurance requirements and in the United States versus Europe and Asia, and how that might be affecting some of these unnecessary code complexities? And I'm specifically thinking about what's about to happen in California, where you can't even get insurance for a house in Los Angeles anymore. So how is that going to drive what the code requirements are in the future there? And how are just the function of our society now in the United States, and how significantly different it is than in Europe. How does that play a role in this?
I would say, for the most part, I feel like insurance is a positive disciplining force. There were some concerns that single stair, insurers will not accept single stair buildings. It hasn't been an issue. They haven't really cared about that. That's what the insurers want. So on the West Coast, it's become almost impossible to build condos. And when you do build a condo, they force you to hire a facade consultant, an envelope consultant, right? This is like a common thing. And what the consultant will tell you is like, stop having so many twists and turns in your facade, stop having so much modulation in the facade. And the planners are like, no, we need that. Like, you can't build the box. So the codes often push, New York City zoning code is a little better about that, but it still requires, step backs, which introduce water infiltration and things like that. And in California, in the fire-prone areas, European would look at that and be like, you guys are nuts building these things out of lightwood frame and then putting sprinklers in them. I mean, in California, they sprinkler single-family houses. What's that going to do in a forest fire, in a wildfire? And indeed, that's exactly what you saw in the Palisades and it was the Altadena, is you had fully sprinklered, brand new houses that just burned to the ground because the fire doesn't care that there's a sprinkler inside. It's going to take out the exterior envelope of the house first. But so the fire officials were concerned about something differently from what the insurance officials, insurers are concerned about. And it's an open question how we're going to solve that because the whole construction industry is oriented towards lightwood frame, and the fire folks aren't going to say, okay, we'll take out the sprinklers if you build the thing out of CMU blocks that can't burn. So, I think the insurers are somewhat of a disciplining force, but I'm not sure that the code officials are really listening to what they have to say about it. So,
how is it different in Europe?
I mean, there's definitely not as much liability, like the tort stuff is not as intense. Like, New York is just run by trial lawyers. I noticed, I was in the subway and I realized, oh my God, all the ads are for personal injury. And sometimes, I've heard that you might notice in New York, we basically don't use tower cranes unless it's like a 40-story building. We build like 10-story buildings without tower cranes. I've heard that, the insurance payouts are, like there was a tower crane that crashed down in Dallas and it killed somebody and the payout was almost $1 billion in the suit. I mean, you can kill 10, Latin American construction workers on a site and not have to pay out $1 billion. So like, what are the courts doing here? What are the lawyers doing? What kind of incentives are they putting in place here? So, I mean, in Europe they don't have the same insurance issues, but they also don't have the same like durability issues. I don't think their buildings are leaking like our buildings are leaking because they're made of more massive materials and they're more boxy. So the insurers did play a big role in the original building codes, like NFPA, or NFPA was a sprinkler thing. But anyway, some of the original building codes were sort of written by insurers. And since then, the insurers have sort of taken a step back, but now they are certainly inserting themselves back in with the climate risk, with the floods and the fires. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond. But overall, I would say they generally exert a positive force when they exert some force. But the exception would be like the tort stuff is just kind of out of control. And it's not really the insurer's fault. I mean, it's the trial lawyers who run everything and then create these insurance issues. So complicated topic. I can't exactly say how it works in Europe, except to say there's not as much tort stuff. And the building codes, I think, are generally more aligned with the concerns of the insurance companies there.
Person there, where the green sweaters, the Danielle had their hand up quite early. Let's do both.
Hi, thanks. This is about the soil projects. I think Warren is condos, correct? It's not a rental building. So,
Yes.
I mean, I can see the idea of the evocative design paying off with respect to condo sales in the short term. I'm just curious, is the larger project a rental project? And what are your thoughts on with rentals, obviously it's far harder to sell that kind of architectural quality, I think. So just your thoughts as opposed to how you see, how would your approach, does your approach work with rentals, or is there actually no chance in that market?
So 450 Union, the 20-story building, is rental, and so that was, I should have mentioned that earlier, but that was a big part of the sort of, let's say, the drivers of the, through the design phases. It's also a much bigger project, so there were different voices from a financing standpoint around what the market, the rental market can bear, and what it's interested in. I will say there are quite a few projects recently in Brooklyn, some of Alloy's projects that are demonstrating that in the rental market, people do care about more than just having a house. And the rates, I would say, in the Brooklyn and New York market are sort of outrageous, what people will pay even for the terrible things that we're talking about here. And of course, I think many of us have probably tried to find an apartment and see what is available. So I think I would say the rental was part of it. The other one was that it's MIH, so mandatory inclusionary housing, so it also includes affordable units. So in general, that was a very different, the pro forma looked a lot different. And I think that's also why you'll see more efficiency in that project. Of course, it's also different typologically, that it's 20 stories instead of 4 or 6 or 8. I think we'll see how it succeeds relative to the other ones, but at least the hypothesis is that this is possible in a rental market, particularly where that's, I think, a really important market in what we're going to start building in New York, and a real priority of Mondani's. And there are whole new, I was just at a event about the Brooklyn Marine Terminal where there's going to be a whole new neighborhood built out in Red Hook. So I think the rental, figuring out a way to make rentals that are better than what we were just talking about before, of a single aspect, deep footprint. So I will say we hope that it works, but we'll let you know in like a year or two when it's done.
First of all, thank you all for wonderful presentations. I have a two-tiered question. One is about, the wonderful projects that you showed, and I'm wondering if you had to go through variances with the Department of Buildings and with the fire department, and what the key battles were, and what advice you have for this room, because, I'm one of many architects that would like to do buildings like that. And the second level of question is really, you've all been on many panels similar to this, and in New York City we can build single stair up to a certain height, which is a little bit better than the rest of the country, except Seattle, I guess. And what should we really be fighting for specifically, and what do you think would work the best for us to really achieve this significant change in the way we build housing, and really further multiple aspect apartments, cross ventilation, quality of life, and I could go on. Thank you.
So I would say, I guess there's been a lot, maybe living in New York, we have less of a sense of how unique New York is relative to the rest of the country. One of the other, I think, really unique and beautiful things about the New York City zoning code is that it's the only as-of-right zoning code in the country, meaning, like in all of these other cities, you have to actually get city planning's input on any project you submit, where all of these projects were as-of-right. So they just had to go through a DOB zoning examiner's evaluation. None of them required variances or special permits or anything, so all of them are as-of-right. As an as-of-right code, because we were doing things that were quite unique, we were in let's say, relatively sophisticated interpretation of the code, and we had to evaluate. So in Vanderbilt, one of the projects that I didn't show, based on each of the projects, the corridors are actually classified differently because they occupy a different part of the code. So some of them are egress balconies, some of them are exterior egress corridors. So the code allows for these things in slightly unique ways that maybe they didn't anticipate they would look like this, but because they're as of right, they don't we're not subject to the whims of a planner's feeling that day about what should or should not be. The other thing that I think we dealt with from a code interpretation standpoint was courtyards. As I'm sure many of you are familiar, courtyards are defined in a quite bizarre way in the New York City zoning code. There's inner courts, outer courts, side courts, center courts, and they have definitions of dimensions that are always drawn as rectangles. As you can tell, actually, these were the more rectangular of the projects, but Vanderbilt and Clinton Hill There are very few 90-degree angles, and so the definition of a court is not super clear of whether it's at root area or what do you dimension off of. Is it perpendicular to the facade, to the property line? So this required a lot of specific code interpretation, and it also required a certain level of risk appetite, let's say, on the side of the development team, knowing that we did have risks going into the zoning meeting, and there were some gray areas that we occupied that the zoning examiner could have interpreted the code differently, and we would have had to negotiate that or change. I will say that probably the projects benefited from maybe like a confetti effect, where the zoning examiners, I think, were just totally overwhelmed by most of these projects, that the nuance maybe got lost on them. So, you know, we had to get specific sign-off. Again, the stainless steel mesh guardrail, everybody feels like it doesn't pass code, but of course it does. It's engineered, it satisfies all of the needs, and the examiner, you know, the inspector, the DOB inspector to give the C of O came and approved it. So I think there were a lot of things that gave a lot of people pause, but that required someone to say, we're okay with this risk, and we'll figure out a path. And we were always planning alternate paths if we couldn't get there. But I would say that was much harder on the 20-story project, where there were less sort of cavalier voices in the room that didn't have the same appetite for risk. And so for that reason, the project is ultimately a little bit less ambitious in the way that it pushed the typology, but so.
I think on the how to make these things happen, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to this, Stephen, in the New York City context, one would be taller single-stair buildings, right? So even at 8 stories, I think you get to start to see a lot more benefits, right? There are a lot of parts of the city where those redevelopments, the redevelopment might make more economic sense. But I think the other part of it too is that, maybe less so here, but on the West Coast, we don't look at a zoning envelope comprehensively, right? Like everything is kind of parcel by parcel. So if you have a block face that's like 20 buildings or 10 buildings, like the zoning really is only looking at it on a parcel by parcel basis. And so like there are ways that we can be rezoning places to be more comprehensive, right? To allow for courtyards, thinner buildings that are taller or something. This is really common in how they plan in a lot of other places, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland do this all day long, but I think it's a much longer process. It requires more engagement, and so a lot of communities are really reticent to do it.
I would say there's a lot about the New York City building code that's better than the rest of the country. I mean, we're way better at resisting the sort of fire safety impulses. I mean, of course, we build everything non-combustible, and that helps. Like for a wish list, so on the zoning side, one of the great things that I could tell that you got in Warren is that the zoning envelope was not so tight because it was a corner site and you got higher lot coverage. I don't think you should get higher lot coverage on an inline lot, but if DCP raised the heights but kept the FARs constant and then relaxed a little on the upper floor setbacks and didn't force you to go through weird dormer rules or whatever, I think that would give the architects a little more breathing room in their envelopes to do something a little more creative. On the building code side, 6 stories, single stair, this is an arbitrary limit. High rise, non-high rise, that is a more based in logic limit. So it'd be nice to just say, as long as it's not a high rise, you can do single stair, which gets you up to 75 feet, measures the top floor level. It'll give you 7 feet in almost 7 stories in almost every circumstance, 8 stories if there's no retail on the ground. I'm not sure that an architect is gonna necessarily know all of the exact details, but we have the things where the New York City building code really falls apart is the MEP things. The labor and the industry, you know, the plumbing companies and the plumbing unions really get their pound of flesh there, and that takes away budget for design and structure. Maybe that's wishful thinking, maybe the cost would just come down, but that would be great too. So, you know, easing up on a lot of these MEP rules. I know a lot about the plumbing ones, but I mean, with the heat pumps, these new A2L fire rated shaft rules are kind of insane, and they're pushing us back to P-tax, which is not a place, sad that we're going back to those. Elevators, you know, like slightly smaller elevators. It would be nice for a single stair building. You know, I understand why the stairway has to be in its own shaft, and it makes sense. However, if you have like balconies on the units, maybe you can have an open stairway, because you have a second way out of the unit. That would be a great reform. As for balconies, we limit them to 2.5 feet over the sidewalk, given that the building has to come up to the sidewalk in most cases, or in many cases at least. It would be nice to relax that to maybe 4 feet, so it's actually a useful balcony, not a developer balcony. You could also put the heat pump out there, probably save some money, maybe not look the best. So anyway, those are my suggestions.
Thank you.
I'll take one more question, I think, because I know James wants to do some announcements right at the end, so. Wait, hands up, who wanted, just your left, okay.
First, thanks so much for the presentations, they were amazing. One thing I'm curious about is my understanding of New York City building code history, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that at one point there was a requirement for each room to have access to fresh air, both from a health perspective and a livability perspective. So I'm wondering if reframing around that kind of requirement that we want, dual aspect or even more than dual aspect, and giving each room that access is something that would be helpful for modern day reform. Kind of sort of related to that, I'm curious about why in the past we had designs like the dumbbell tenements where we had cutouts that were used in order to bring in fresh air and light again. Why those elements have kind of sort of receded, and if reintroducing those has some positive benefits when combined with a single stair, point access, etc. Like when you can give even a one-bedroom apartment access to multiple aspects, if that's something that works well together with the other reforms we've discussed here.
So the dumbbell thing went out of style for a couple of reasons, but I think it might come back in a small way with the City of Yes reforms. You used to have to, the courtyard, oh God, you guys will know this better, I'm not gonna embarrass myself, but I don't know, there used to be 30 feet of clearance you needed, now it's 20 feet, plus some other dimensional things have been loosened. So we might see some more courtyards with that. And then also, I guess just the stringency of the building envelope has maybe been loosened a little, and it'd be nice to loosen it a little more to get that. I think Mike talks a lot about the natural cross ventilation. In Seattle, realistic. In the United States, or excuse me, in New York, you can get the cross ventilation, but like a New York City summer is never going to be livable with just the windows open, especially since like how loud the city is. So I like the the drama of the multiple aspects and everything. It might be a slightly harder sell given that you kind of have to just use air conditioning no matter what you have. Although there are definitely like days in the shoulder season when if my unit could cross ventilate, like I would not have the air conditioning on, whereas I do now. I think it's like a good talking point to use. I don't know that I found that it doesn't really work on building officials. That's my experience. Yeah, that's my comment about that.
I think this goes back to the question around typologies too. So in a lot of European cities, they'll do they call it like a Vorder house release. So it's like a front house and a back house. So if you had like a 150-foot lot, you'd have like a 60-foot building on the front, maybe 8 stories, and then you've got like my math is going to be horrible, 50 feet for a courtyard, and then you'll have another building on the back. Maybe it's not quite so tall, right? I think there are ways to like reintroduce some of these older typologies from other cities that will allow for significant amounts of density while still allowing for much better places to live.
Does it work? Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to cheat and ask a question real quick. Sorry, I wanted to know, Stephen, how do you decide? Like those were really good topics, right? Like the plumbing vent, the elevator that we always learned about, the gurney, like how and following the money kind of tells you some of the story. How do you decide each year what you're gonna tackle?
Well, Mike dictated the first one, which you got single stair, everyone talking about. So had to do that one, that was a big one. The plumbing thing, I found someone who was really passionate about plumbing, and so I hired him, so he's doing the plumbing stuff. The elevator sort of flowed naturally from the stair, because like, okay, so you allow a single stair, but now you have this crazy expensive elevator. Like how are you, how are you going to justify the cost of an elevator if there's only 1 to 4 units per core? So that's how elevators came about. And the rest of it, I just have such a long list, and I guess I try to pick like the biggest cost drivers, although it gets more difficult because as you go, like on your Warren Street project, for example, I noticed some of the exterior had sprinklers on it. And Ted was telling me, well, it was, I don't know, it was debatable, but we had to do it. Anyway, that's not going to be individually a large cost, but there's so many of those ridiculous. Like, why are we sprinkling the outside of a building? So there's so many little things, and it becomes difficult. I'll probably prioritize things based on who I can find to write a report about it, I guess. It's really hard to find someone who's like passionate about the code and also is willing to like harass enough contractors to give them like a quote. Because like, you know, contractors sort of, they're not email people, you know what I mean? So to find, like, frankly, a lot of it is you find someone who's passionate about it and who's willing to like take on the topic. Because like you can, like every little part of a building, you can find something to critique about it.
Excellent. Well, if you know any of those people, send them his way so we can take care of it. I just wanted to thank the panelists and the moderator and City Tech for letting us be here. And I want James to give you some upcoming cool stuff happening with Brooklyn AIA.
Okay, James Coster, I'm Executive Director. I'm going to cover very, very quickly, put in a plug for a couple of things that are coming up. I'm going to take the last one first. April of next year, AI Brooklyn is launching its first ever exhibition at the L10 Library Space. We are seeking volunteers, people who want to participate in the web development, the exhibit design, and a whole host of things. And there's a planning call. Is there a planning? Where's David?
He left. He's gone.
Where are you, David?
He left.
He split? Jeez, okay. So there's a planning call on Monday, and they're seeking volunteers to participate in that whole thing. It's going to be unique. It's going to be first ever, very public facing, and a really good move for the chapter.
It's called Brooklyn Now.
Huh?
Brooklyn Now.
Brooklyn Now 2026. And starting with the end of this month, BKP is running that ARE study group on the 22nd. If any of you are studying for your architectural record exam, this is a great way to get a leg up. We have an on-the-menu webinar with Soltage. Similar to some of the solar things that we're talking about tonight, this is a localized power storage system that is meant to help offset power surges or power shortages during peak demand periods. And that's on December 4th. It's a webinar. And I have to put a plug for the Brooklyn Design Awards Gala and Award Celebration on December 8th at 501 Union. That's from 6 to 9. You can get tickets on Eventbrite. And our annual chapter meeting, where we will vote on that budget we looked at earlier, is on December 17th at 6 p.m. on Zoom. And the last event for this season will be a webinar with Sawkill Lumber, who interestingly is not going to talk about lumber. He's going to talk about the history of the American Institute of Architects. And give us a really interesting history lesson. And that webinar is on December 18th. So check the website, check the calendar, sign up. And thanks again to City Tech, thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to Julie for this Herculean lift in getting all these great panelists together.
Oh, that's it, but you forgot to mention that you can be in the exhibit, your projects. It's about Brooklyn architecture.
Yes.
So you don't have to only volunteer, you have to like submit your projects. So your projects will make it into a website, every project.
Every
And
project's on
then
a website.
I think it's like a curated